Okay, so we started Baruch Hashem. We started the new parak last week, Hamafkid, which is in Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, Bava Metzia. We started the parak Hamafkid, and we started with the Mishnah and the early part of the Gemara. So basically, just a quick review because we're going to pick it up from here. Is Hamafkid deals with not Metzias, not lost objects, but when objects are actually transferred between an owner and someone, whether it's to guard it or to lease it or to borrow it, whatever the case may be. We call the four shomrim, right? Shomachinam, Shomasacha, Socha, and Shayalim. Those are the four categories of people who we talk about. And the Mishnah just summarizes and says that if a person delivers in some fashion to his friend a behema or a kalim, and then depending on what happened, it was stolen, it was lost, it broke, it disappeared, any number of things, then that launches the whole discussion about who is chayiv for what. So essentially the Mishnah tells us that the shomer has two choices. And here he's talking about a shomer chinam at this point. Because a shomer chinam has no responsibilities except for carelessness. His own carelessness he's responsible for, but nothing else. But if it all of a sudden disappears, then he has no legitimate responsibility. But as Rashi explained, there's something called the shvua shomrin. He has to make a shvua and basically say that he wasn't careless or that he didn't convert it himself, meaning he liked it so much that he took it for himself. Those are the two things that the shomer has to sort of testify to and say, I wasn't careless and I did not take it for myself, and then he's exempt. So that's the approach of the Mishnah. And then the Mishnah says, then depending on what happens, if the ganav is or the person is found, let's say it was a ganav, he was found, he has to pay kefel, and we'll talk about kefel in a minute. Kefel means double, or tevach hamachar, if he uses the animal, he slaughters it, he sells it, he does something with it, then there's a further penalty of 4 to 5 times the value of the actual chayfetz. Now, the object of the Mishnah is to make us understand how bialus ownership changes. How does it change? What happens? So essentially, the Mishnah tells us that if the shomer swears and said it wasn't me, I had nothing to do with it, then it remains in the reshus of the owner, and the owner basically has to roll the dice. He either will lose it all, or he'll get it back in kefil, or he'll get it back in dalet v'hei, because he has no choice. If, however, as often happens, a shomer does not want to swear, because the idea of swearing and using God's name to many people is really distasteful. It's not something, even if it's a legitimate shvua, there's a shvua in the Torah, but I don't want to swear. I don't want to use God's name. So he said, I'd rather pay than swear, in which case, says the Mishnah, then the ownership of that item transfers to the shomer. The shomer becomes the owner because he has paid for it. And if it's later found, then all of those items we talked about, kefel, dalet v'hei, all belong to the shomer because he essentially has become the owner. The question arises: what about how does that happen? In other words, you don't just flick a finger and slip him $10 and now it's yours. There has to be a kinyan, as we all know. Kinyan is part of the process of any transfer of ownership. So we say that the kinyan appears, the kinyan actually happens when the shomer receives the item, the kalim or the animal. So there's a kabbalah's kinyan. That's the kinyan. He now has it in his possession, and from there he can decide to either return it or pay. And once he pays, then he has a kinyan and it's his. So essentially, that summarizes the Mishnah, but explains to us what we're about to learn now is that there's a choice, and the choice is made by the shomer, Now, the owner can override the choice. The owner can always say, I don't want shvuas, I don't want anything, I want to remain the owner. He can override the shomer and basically say, it's mine, I'm going to keep it, I'll take my loss or not, depending on what happens later. But since the tenor of the Gemara is that an owner is risk averse, in other words, he doesn't want to take a risk. He owns something, he wants to continue to have it. So if he's risk averse, he'd rather have the money for the value of the item and turn over any profits, kefel, dollars v'hei, to the shomer as a potential for him being paid today. So that's the important condition here, is he's risk averse. And all he wants is what he owns. He owns this simple little animal. It's worth $100. That's what he wants. He doesn't want any special, dispensation for loss or anything else. So because of that principle of being risk averse, he gives it. He makes a kinyan. He gives it to the shomer, and now the shomer is the owner, and the shomer is responsible. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, as an aside, asks the question: why do we need behema and kalim, and why do we need both? A behema, you can use one or the other. The Gemara, the short answer, without going through everything, is that we need each one of them, because from one I couldn't learn the other. If we had behema, I wouldn't learn kalim, and if we had just kalim, I wouldn't learn behema, because each has different principles. So the Gemara has to give us each principle, the principle of behema, which is a bigger animal for which there is more tircha, and also for kalim, that in other words, whether or not a person would be willing to receive his money today in exchange for 4 or 5 times the amount later on. So, okay, that was that Gemara. So now we're up to 4 lines from the bottom. And now we're going to speak directly to the Mishnah. So now the Mishnah has just told us what we just repeated. And this kasha is perhaps one of the most obvious kashas that all of us, if we're thinking about all the principles we've learned, should ask the kasha. Maskifle, Rabbi Bar Chama asks a gewaldige kasha. How can you have these transactions where the owner takes money from the shomer and says, okay, I have my money, you have the item, whatever happens, and I'm happy for you if they catch it because you'll get kefil or daled v'hei. How can that ever happen? It's a davar shelo bola olam. It has yet to unfold. It hasn't been stolen. Remember, the transference of ownership happens at the very, very beginning. At the very beginning, all he did was he took the animal or the keli, and they did a meshicha or masira. That's all they did. Nothing has happened. Zero. And you're telling me that lays the groundwork for all kinds of things that happen later on. How can the owner be makne? How can there be a transference of ownership on something that never happened? One of the famous svaras in Gemara. So that's the Gemara's kasha. That's his kasha here. What you're building a whole foundation and a whole Indian here on what's going to happen in the future. The future never happened, and you can't predict the future. And because of that, it's a davar shelo b'olei olam. So that's the kasha. It's a gewaldige kasha. And let's take a look at Rashi. How can the owner be makne, transfer, kefel to the shomer? We don't even have a ganef. Who says it's going to be stolen? Who says anything? So in other words, we're making this up, and because we're making it up, we're saying, oh, we're going to build this whole big binyan. Can't do it. It's a davar shelo b'olei olam. Okay, that's the kasha.
It sounds like Rabbi Bar Chama would object. Sounds like Rabbi Bar Chama would object to any insurance policy.
Yeah, but there you have a shtar, and there you have an agreement. There you have ishtar, and there you have an agreement that is a arm's length transaction. It's not necessarily dependent. We're not saying it's dependent on an event. Yes, the event would trigger it, but there's consideration. There's everything given, and if it doesn't happen, then fine. It's a regular contract. I mean, any contract that you and I sign for something to happen, you can say is a future contract, and you can ask the kasha. But here we're specifically asking the kasha because he transferred ownership to him. He no longer has the ownership, and it's dependent on something that has to happen that may not happen. But in theory, your question is interesting because I mean, our whole business model is predicated on futures, right? When we talk about buying futures, what's that futures? Futures is a double shalom bol olam. How do you transact with something that doesn't happen? You know, okay, so we're going to see the Gemara's answer as to how maybe we get around that. But in principle, what he's asking is that this whole transaction is based on a event that may never happen. In which case, how do you have a kinyan? And under Jewish law, obviously under secular law, we can do what we want, but under Jewish law, there has to be a kinyan of mamashis, of something that has mamish. And here it's not a mamish.
And even under secular law, the essence of the contract that Jay is talking about talks about something that didn't happen. That's the whole point of it. It's not just an aside or, you know, an adjunct to the transaction.
Right.
It is the essence of the transaction. So maybe that's one way to look at it.
No, that's right. The whole transaction is about something that
Right.
Right.
That is the essence of it, rather than being just an adjunct to what's going on. And then you can say, well, wait a minute, it didn't happen yet. How, you know.
Yeah. So but I feel the Rab Meir. Now, Davar Shalom Bol Olam, by the way, is not a universal concept. It's not something that everybody agrees to. There is a Rab Meir who says the Omar or the Makna Davar Shalom Bol Olam. So Rab Meir himself says that a person can be makne. So it's not a total
universal, right?
So what do you say according to Rab Meir? Says the Gemara. You know what? We're going to qualify Rab Meir. Hanamili. When does Rab Meir say his double shalabola or the bava that you can do it? You're going Paris dekel the other the awesome. Paris dekel. Year in, year out, this tree blossoms. It gives off. It's a beautiful fragrance. Fruit grows on it without fail, right? So now we have a chazaka of who knows how many years that this tree gives off the fruit. So he says, so we're trying to distinguish Rab Meir. When does Rab Meir say Davar Shalom Bol Olam is okay? Peres Dekel David Asa, where the likelihood is 99.999 that this year will be like last year, like the year before. It'll in the spring the blossoms will come and the fruit will come, right? So we can almost rely on it and say, yeah, it's a Davar Shalom Bol Olam, but it's a guaranteed. So maybe that's when Rab Meir says it's okay. Says Rashi. I feel Rab Meir. Now it's interesting because what Rab Meir says has nothing to do with Ilan Hadeka. But let's take a look at Rashi. I feel Rab Meir Dama Perik Gimel the Kedushin. Hari at Mekadeshas Li. There's a famous Gemara. Hari al Menashe Agayer. A man is not Jewish, and he says to his kala, Hari at Mekadeshas Li. And the condition is that I will be Megayer afterwards. After the Kedushin, I will be Megayer, right? So the Gemara there says that he can do that. That there is a machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman on the case of Ilan Hadekel, and the Gemara there says that Rav Huna holds like Rav Meir. So that's how we get to Rav Meir. Rav Meir doesn't talk about this. Rav Meir talks about a ger. He talks about a ger. But Rav Huna and Rav Nachman argue in Eza Neshech on the question of the tree, and the Gemara there says, and Rav Huna holds like Rav Meir Shita, which is what? That you can be makne davar shelo bol olam under certain circumstance. So bottom line, what's the exception? The exception is when we can say with virtual certainty that it's going to happen. Okay, if it's going to happen, then we say, all right, it's okay. We accept, even though it's not here this instant, we accept it. Aval hacha, but here in our particular case, our Mishnah, who says it's going to be stolen? Who says this that it didn't even happen? The intim saloma de migdava, and if you want to tell me that it's going to be stolen, miyom de mishtaka, ganav. How do you know they'll find the ganav? And if they find the ganav, miyom de mishalem. How do you know he's going to pay kefel? Wait a minute, we have another little issue on kefel. Why? Dilma amoda a miftar. Maybe he'll be moida a miftar. The pasuk says very beferish in mishpatim, right? What does the pasuk say in mishpatim? It tells us that ki yitein ish el re'eyu, it's mishpatim chav beis, ki yitein ish el re'eyu kesef al kelim lishmor. This is our case, right? Shem echinam. V'gunaf mibeis ish, and it's stolen. Im yimotze hagana if yishalem shnayim. If you find him and you prosecute him, he pays twice. Im lo yimotze hagana, v'nikav balavayis elokim, im lo shalach yelem b'mlechus re'eyu. And it goes on to say that that you have to be able to conclude through Bezdin. In other words, there has to be an actual Bezdin, and you have to conclude that he stole it. Then you get kefil. What happens if he comes and says, "Mea culpa, I took it. I made a mistake. I didn't take it." There's no kefil. So this whole thing of kefil has so many ifs on it. So the Gemara says, you know why? It's a davar shalom bol olam, because A, who says it's going to be stolen? And if you're going to steal, who says you'll find the ganav? And if you find the ganav, maybe he'll be moda and you won't have to pay kefil.
Well, why doesn't he have to pay kefil if he's moda? He says it was a mistake.
Because he the Torah tells us that has to be an edict of a bezdin. If it's not an edict of a bezdin, then there is no kefil.
But the point is, why? So the point is, if the ganav comes in his moda, it's viewed as he made a mistake. It's not really ganav. Correct. And therefore, there is no punishment that can be. If you come to a court and say this was all a misunderstanding, here's the item: the bezdin won't levy the kefil penalty.
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
That's correct. So Rashi says, "Me yoymed demignav also he gonna delik the kefil b'shas masira." In other words, remember the whole point of this is that at the time of masira, when the owner transferred the keli or the behema, whatever, to the shomer, kefel was an outcome that could happen here, right? Because if he's found and prosecuted, you get kefel. So Rashi also higana. Who says he'll steal? Delik kefel b'shas masira. That you can say that there is a hint of kefel at the time of masira. The al karkach mishas masira boy like nuye. We have to say, as we started saying last week, that when is the transfer of ownership? At the time of masira, when he gave him the thing to watch, right? Shemashch memenu amanas came. So the whole event happened at the very beginning, before any hint of Geneva or Aveda or anything like that, and because of that, he transfer ownership. So the shomer swear, and the shomer pays. He says, "No, I'd rather pay than swear. Now I'm the owner." Says the Gemara. Okay, how do you know? To davar shalom bol olam, and there is no let's call it logical, likely outcome that it will happen. There are too many bumps along the way that will prevent this from happening. So that's the Gemara's kasha over there. That's the kasha. How do you know? So emphasis the Gemara. So the Gemara wants to say, Omar Rava, Nase Omala. It doesn't mean with 100% certainty that this will happen. It's Nase Omala. It's as if he said, the Shekatigna, when it will be stolen, quote, if it will be stolen. V'tirtza v'tishlame, and you will want to pay. Hare parasi kanuya loch me'achshav. The owner is saying, he's giving him the right to say, you're just borrowing this, or I'm giving it to you as a shomer because you're doing me a nice favor. I have to go out of town. You're holding the item for me. But if it should come to pass that something will happen to this item and you will want to pay for it, v'tirtza v'tishlame, hariparasi kanuyaloch me'achshav. Now, why is this important? Because we're going to see in the Gemara a very big difference between maybe I'll pay you or I will pay you in the future to I paid you. There is a difference, and the Gemara will explain to us the difference between I gave you the money, I paid you, or I will pay you under certain circumstances. So Rashi says, Nasik Omelo, right? Third line, Bishosh Mosrelo. At the time that he did the Mesira, the Kaim Rabbanan, the rabbis accepted the Nichele Lebalim Shia Betuach Bekeren. Remember, he's risk averse. He's risk averse. So he rather would be Betuach Bekeren. He'll be certain on his keren, on his animal. Al Menashia Sofik Kefil Ha'osud Lovo Shel Shomer.
Right, he's willing to pass up on that, on the possibility of a greater windfall.
Of a greater windfall, right. Baharihu Kamosrolo Al Menas Kain. And it's as if he gave it the Mesira, the actual Kenyan was on that condition. She'im Tignav, he didn't pay him, but he gave it to him on the condition. She'im Tignav, Yishalem Lo Keren, that if it's stolen and the Shomer will pay the Keren, Shetiapara Kanuyalo, that the paro will be a kona to him, Mishah Shemasra, back from when he gave it to him. Nimsa Lemafreya, we find that in retrospect, Lemafreya in the beginning, when he stole it, it belonged to the Shomer, the para kava hoya ba'olam. Underscore that. The para was already in the oilam. The para existed. So in other words, it's a davar shelo bola olam is something that is not on the face of the earth. This animal existed. This keli existed on the face of the earth, right? It's just that the transaction hadn't been completed, but it was a retroactive, just like the ger who wants to be Megayer after the fact, and he's marrying and he's doing Kedushin today. So in other words, the Gemara is saying, the Rava is saying, you know what? Nasik Omelo, we're going to solve the problem. Because it's as if he said to him, if this and this and this happens, then you're going to go ahead and be kone me'achshav, meaning from the beginning. Okay, so we've answered the kasha, that it's not a question of davar shelo bola olam, because first of all, the chayfetz, the keli or the behemoth, is in the world. So you can't say it's not in the world, it's in the world. The question is, where is the bilus? And from this Gemara, we see that in the beginning, there's uncertain bias, because he said to him, if you will want to do this, you can do this. But later on, when he does do it, it's as if he did it in the very beginning. So that's an important concept to keep in mind, because we're going to see how that plays out, that he basically can play a little fast and loose. He doesn't have to make the commitment right now. He can make the commitment later, and it will be lemafreya, as if it happened before. Okay, we understand. That's a logical answer. Says the Gemara, wait a minute. I'm not satisfied with that answer that Rava just gave. Maskin Rab Zera. So Rab Zera is asking kasha on Rava's compromise. Rava just said, Nasik Omala. It's as if he said it. He didn't say it, but it's as if he said it. Okay, and that answers the question. Says Rab Zera, Yehacha Afila Gizusa Vilidusa Nami, then he should be entitled to the shearings and the children, or the offspring of this animal. Alama Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Chutz mi Gizusa Vilidusa. There's another brisa somewhere else, which when the Rebbe was Mesader, he was Mesader without a name, right? Because we know from previous Gemara that at the time when Rebbe was Mesader, he started pulling things together and made a very organized form of Mishnah, but not everything was attributed. So that brisa there says that you get everything except for the shearings and the children of the offspring. Why? If he owns it, he should get the shearings and the offspring as well. Why is he not getting it? So that's the kasha. That's the kasha on Rava. If Rava is going to say you can do this, then it's his. If it's his lamafreya from the time of the Masira of the actual transference, he should get everything. El Rab Zera. So now Rab Zera adds a word on to Rava's teretz. Nase ka'omalo. It's as if he said, not only as if he said you'll get it. It's as if you said chutz migezusa v'ledusa. So in other words, we have a nase ka'omalo twice. Nase ka'omalo. It's as if he said you'll be kaina, and also nase ka'omalo that you won't get the offspring and the shearings. Says Rashi ihacha the nimtza shahoisa shalo mishas rishona. Again, Rashi spells it out clearly. If it turns out that it was his from the very beginning, yiske af begizus vilodos shahayalo mishabah lebeso, because that was technically his already when it came into his house, because he owns it. The kivan, the gana, the nignav, the ratza v'shilim nimtza shalom afreya. So why is he not getting all the everything else? So he says, because the Bryce is saying, as if he said you own everything except this. Frank, the Gemara or my Piska, where do you know this from? You're making this up. All of a sudden you're telling me, that everything is okay except that. Where's the except? Right? It says Rashi Piska, Pesakta Hadava B'chol Adam Shedata Lahaknos Kefil Imyavel Kachva Indata Lahaknos Holodos. You're telling me that when a person makes that kinyan, everybody has in mind kefil, but he doesn't have in mind the offspring of the animal. If anything, the offspring of the animal is more likely than kefil, right? Because if you don't find the ganef, or like we said before, he's maida, whatever, you don't get kefil. But if that animal has given birth to babies, you get it. So there's even a greater likelihood maybe that he'll get the offspring of the animal than he'll get kefil. Why should he give that up? Kefil is maybe you're taking a chance. Like you said, who says it'll be stolen? Who says it'll be found? Who says anything? But children, if it's a female animal, there's a good likelihood it'll give birth, and he'll make some money on it. Why would he give that up? That's the kasha. This is nasa ka'omalo b'shasha masvula. Okay, so my pasakta. So here, this is a very interesting answer. Stama de milsa shavcha de osam alma ovid inish demakne. Shavcha de megufa lo ovid inish demakne. It's an interesting concept. A person, there's two forms. Let's just say in this particular case, there's two forms of potential profits that the shomer can have here. One is from within the animal, and one is from without the animal. So the Gemara is saying that the mindset of a person is, you know what? I'm going to get my carrot. I'm satisfied. If there's kefel or dalet v'hei and there's a windfall, I'm okay with that because I never had that. That was something that was outside of my domain. I got mine back, and if it should so happen that they find the ganef and you get it, I'm willing to give it to you. Fine. But an animal, the natural inclination of the animal, if it's let's say a female animal, is to give birth, or to have, if it's a goat, to have wool or whatever. That a person's mindset is, wait a minute, that's mine. That's mine. I didn't give that away. That's part of my animal that I own. So in other words, something that I own that's within my animal, I'm not so fast to give it away because it's mine. Something that I never had, kefel, dalet v'hei, sure, take a chance. Give me my keren, and you take a chance on kefel and dalet v'hei. So the Gemara is answering that the reason why that brisa says chutz migezusa v'ledusa is because the normal thinking of a person is not to give away that which is within the animal. So look at the lashon, the asama ovid inish demakne shavka, the megufa from the body, lo ovid inish demakne. If it comes from the gufa of the animal, the person's not so quick to give it away. And shearings and children from the animal, that's from within the animal. If it's from outside the animal, yeah, sure, I'll make that trade-off. So that's Rav Zera's teretz, and that's why he says it's a legitimate answer, even though the Brisa there says that he doesn't get the shearings and the flock. It's because a person makes that mental compromise in his mind, and he says, I'm willing to give that away, but I'm not willing to give away everything else.
It's the reasonable person test, if you
The
will.
reasonable person test. The most, again, we're talking about someone who's risk averse. So
Right,
I gave you
okay.
my animal. All I want is my animal back. I'm not looking for any big investment here.
But even a risk-averse person would still use the what a reasonable person would expect. That's
Correct. So that's what Rav Zera says. That's why Rav Zera says the price is correct when it says except for shearings and biludusa, because those are items that are personal to the animal that a person somehow feels belongs to him, and it's not something he's willing to give away, right? Okay.
Also, those go into the valuation of the animal. If you were to sell the animal, you'd make it, it's not just that every cow is the same. A cow that's productive, whether it's producing
If it's fertile and
milk
everything,
or it's fertile,
you can get more.
you're going to get more for it.
Right, exactly. And a goat or sheep or other animal that has
Wool,
shearings,
right?
You say over the life of the animal, I'll have X dollars worth of profit from that. Exactly right. So it's an interesting carrots, but and that's how he assuages. That's how Rav Zera answers the kasha. Now, so okay, so Zok the Gemara. So that now we have a term. My benaya. Now, so what's the kasha? My benaya. So we gave ourselves two terutzim, right? Right. We gave ourselves two terutzim. First, we said that the first teretz we said that a person. Oh, I'm sorry. So, no, I'm sorry. We have to back up. Okay. So, Shafta Asama Alma Ovid Shafta. Iked de Amre. Sorry, I skipped over it. So that's the teretz to other Gemara. Now there's an Iked de Amre in Rava. There is an Iked de Amre that Rava's teretz is a little bit different. What is the Iked de Amre? Amar Rava Nase Omalo. It's as if he said to him, the Shekatigno, the Tirza, the Tashlomi, Somach Lignevusa, Kunuyalov. In the first instance, take a look at Rava. Rava says, Hare Porosi Konoloch Me Achshav. Right? Look at the Lashon, the third line from the bottom. Omar Rava, Nasika Omalo, it's as if he said, the Shekatigno, the Tirza, the Tashlomi, Hari Parosi Kanuyaloch Me Achshav. From now. What's the now? The now is when I actually gave you the item to guard. That was the original wording in Rava. Comes the Iked the Amre and says, no, Rava's version is a little bit different. Amar Rava, Nasa, it's as if Ka'omalo the Shekatigna, the Tirza, the Tishlami, Somech Lignevusa Kanuyaloch. You know when you're going to own it? Not Me Achshav, but Samach Ligenvusa. So let's say he gave it to him on Rosh Chodesh Adar. And on Rosh Chodesh Adar, according to the first version, that's when the Kinyan happened. And that's when the Shomer took over control of the animal. Rosh Chodesh Adar. Fine. Then the Gemara gives us this whole spiel and we understand. Comes the Ikrid Amre and says, no. You know when this happened? This happened on Rosh Chodesh Adar. But the owner said to him, the Shekatigno, if it will be stolen, and you'll want to pay me, and this happens on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, a whole few months later. When will you be the owner? On Rosh Chodesh Sivan, not on Rosh Chodesh Adar. So in other words, according to this version, the period between Adar and Sivan, who's the owner? The original guy. So That, in other words, that Ikad Amri is saying that's when the Shomer will take over control if he chooses to pay for it. So, by the way, this answers the question of the Brisa, why he doesn't get the shearings, is because he never owned it. He never owned it from Adar to Sivan. So if there was children and there was shearings, it doesn't come into question because it's the original owner. That's how he answers that question, because he never owned it. So according to this version, he owns it only if he makes the choice at the time. Frek the Gemara ma benaya. Now the Gemara says, what's the chilik between the first version of Rava and the second version of Rava? And for the Gemara, benaya kusha de Rav Zera. Then the difference is the kasha that we just posed from Rav Zera, which is, what about the shearings? And the answer is very simple. In the first version, he was kind of everything from Rosh Chodesh Adar. Therefore, the shearings and everything should belong to him. It does belong to him because he owns it. But according to the second version, he doesn't own it because he hasn't exercised the right yet. The right is only when it happens, when the Geneva happens. So according to the second version, he loses out. Inami, there's a second difference. The kaima ba'agam. So, and again, this goes back to our whole understanding. The kaima ba'agam means if the animal at the time was found in a swamp, meaning it was not in a rishus, it was not in a private domain. So if you say, according to the first version, that he owned it, when did he own it? At the time of the Masira. At the time of the Masira, it was in the rishus of the Baalim. So the Baalim had the right. In other words, the Baal goes to the Shomer and says, here it is. And we're making so I'm giving you a Mashiach, I'm giving you a Kenyan, and it's a my rishus, and it's a Davar Shabola Olam, no problem. But in the second case, where it only happens, when it happens, and he says, when it happens, the animal was not in a rishus, it was in a swamp. It was a hefker. It was sitting somewhere where nobody had rishus over it. In which case, you can't make the transference. So according to this second version, he cannot make the transference to the shomer, and the shomer can never be kaineh. So in other words, this whole thing of kefil can never happen because he can't be an owner. How can he be an owner and not take and not be Mikabel Kinyan because it's sitting in a swamp? So according to that second version, the original owner is out of luck, meaning his risk-averse position is now cut out because he can't make a transference. He can't say, "Oh, I just want my animal. You can have kefil." How can you can't have kefil? You didn't make a Mashiach, you didn't make a Masira, you didn't make a Kinyan. So there's no potential for kefil. Forget about the shearings. That Abada is not. But even going forward, you can't be the owner here because there was no proper transference. So that's the Gemara is trying to explain the chilik between the two Iked Amres, as in the second one. And by the way, this is important, as we're going to see, is because again, it's the question of whether he paid or whether he promised to pay. That becomes a very, very important condition. But for our purposes, there was never a Kinyan. It was in an agam. It was in a swamp. So he could never properly transfer, the owner could never properly transfer over to the shomer. Okay. So Rashi says, Kashid Rav Zera, Lelishna Basra, according to the second Lashon, meaning the Iked Amre, Lekelak Shura Gizas Viladas, the Hasamach Universa Hudeknoi. There was never a question about the shearings and the children because it was never his. Inami, the Havakaima Ba'agam, says Rashi, Kishaganva Ganef, Lalishna Basra, according to the Iked Amre, when the Ganef stole, Lo Koneh Kafela. He wasn't kind of kefil, the Hasamach Universa Lo Haisa. It was not in his rishus, Sheti Chatzera Konalo, or Mashiach Hu Shata Lo Hava. There was no Mashiach. Like we said, there was no Kinyan. But my nickname, how will he possibly be kind of? So in other words, the original owner is stuck with it, and he can't barter the value of the animal for kefil. It's out of his control. The im timer, and if you will ask, Tiknali Mashiach Rishona. Well, wait a minute, there was a Mashiach Rishona back in Rosh Chodesh Adar when he gave it to him. Shemashchalo al manas liknosa. Shah hasmucha l'gnevasa haminan b'ksubis b'isha shenaflu on the fasim. Omer l'chavero moshach parazu lo maknele el achas shloshim lo kana. In other words, you want to do a little trick. You'll say, you know what? I really transferred to him at the very beginning, but I said it would come into effect if he were to agree that he would take it over later on. In other words, he'll want to go back and say, yeah, the Mashiach really happened at the very beginning, right? But it wasn't chal until now. And that's what he brings down. He says, here, make a Mashiach, but it shouldn't be makna to you. Lo kana. Remember, there's a difference between saying, we're making a kinyan now. Here's the kinyan now, and you own it now, but you have to wait 30 days for it to come into fruition. That's the case, for instance, of the ger. If the ger wants to marry the woman, hakik kedushin bichal, because la'achar shloshim yom or whatever it is, he'll be megayer from the day that he said hariyat mikudeshes.
Don't we also say stam that if a person says hariyat mikudeshesly 30 days from now, it's a good kedushin, Jen, isn't it?
Yeah, but he won't. But he's not around 30 days from now. He's around now, and he says hariyat mikudeshesly now. But since kedushin can't be chal because he's not yet converted. So the Gemara says that kedushin is chal because he made it now. It should be chal now.
I'm saying that even applies not in the case of a ger. It even applies generally if a person says, "I want to be mekadosh somebody 30 days from now." It's considered a good kedushin, isn't it?
Oh, you mean if someone says hariyat mikudeshes in 30 days?
I think that's one of the cases.
If he says,
I think it is because the theory is that it's a good kedushin because there's no reason it shouldn't be. You just put a precondition on it, that it takes effect.
Precondition for the kedushin.
In other words, if someone else comes and tries to be mekadosh that woman,
Right.
I don't think it's good.
Right.
I'm not sure, but
Okay, we'll have to double
remind
check.
me.
I think you're right. We'll double check. But here he says the Gemara brings down the Gemara brings down in Shubis, Omer l'chavero moshach parazu. Make a Mashiach, below mikna loch, and it will not be mikna to you. Ela la'achas shloshim yom lo kana. You cannot be kona. You will not be kona. So what do we see? We see that you can't do this and make it retroactive. So this fellow who says, "Oh, I'll take it over just as soon as it's stolen, then I'll take it over." And what's the kinyan? The kinyan is the one that we made 3 months ago. That doesn't fly. It doesn't fly. So in other words, that's the chilik over here as to why the chilik between whether or not he can be kinda or not from the beginning. So that Mashiach in the beginning only works if you actually transact and say, this Mashiach is what is going to be the kinyan between us. But if you play a little bit fast and loose and say, nah, it's not really. But if it gets stolen later on, and you're going to want to say, I'll take the chance on Kefel, then we're going to go back to the beginning and say that this one worked. Doesn't work that way. Can't work that way. So in other words, we see that the Mashiach, the kinyan has to be at the time that you make it, which in our case was that we said was Chodesh Adar. But if he didn't make it and it only happened right around Chodesh Sivan, you're out of luck. Then you can't do it. All right. So that's the end of that section of the Gemara, where the Gemara tells us as to how we should understand this whole process of kinyan for purposes of the shomer being able to take over the item. Okay. Let's just start the beginning of the next header. We're going to have to just touch on it for a minute. So the first part. So what does the Mishnah say? If he pays and he doesn't want to swear, then the shomer can take it over because he doesn't want to swear. So he's allowed to take it over. So now this will touch on what I was saying earlier, that lo shilem mamish, when he said, I don't, when it says shilem, it doesn't mean mamish shilem, that he actually transferred the money. In other words, the question is, when he says shilem v'lo rotza l'shava, right? Says Rabbi Hyatt, he didn't actually pay him. He committed to paying him, but he didn't pay him. Okay? Since he says, I will pay you, even though he didn't actually pay, but he's committed to paying, that's enough. That he will pay is good enough. Okay? Now, we'll go a little further and then we'll stop. So says the Gemara, wait a minute, that's problematic. Look at our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says, Tanan, Shilen v'lo rotza l'shava. If the shomer wants to pay and not swear, what do we deduce from that? Shilen in, lo shilen lo. We have other Gemaras like this as well. In other words, it says Shilen. On the surface, it says he paid. Shilen, he paid. V'lo rotza l'shava. So we conclude, or we extrapolate, Shilen in, if he pays, it's his. Lo shilen lo.
It has to be an actual payment.
In actuality.
Yes.
In actuality. Frek the Gemara. So the Gemara is saying, but wait a minute, Ema Seifa. Look at the Seifa of the Mishnah. What does the Seifa say? Nishba v'lo rotza l'shalem. If he swears and he doesn't want to pay, right? That was the flip side of that coin. Tama de lo rotza. The reason why he doesn't get it is because he didn't want rotza or rotza, but if he would have wanted afapi shelo shilem. So you see from the Sefer that he doesn't have to pay because it uses the word rotza. If he, in other words, if he swears and does not want to pay, but if he wants to pay, then we accept it, even though he hasn't paid. How can you say in the ratio that it's shilem in, ain't shilem lo? Again,
How do you know if the person wants to pay or not?
we're just looking at the words of the Mishnah. The words of the Mishnah is what we're taking out of here. The first part says shilem, and we say shilem in, lo shilem lo. If he paid, the word paid is used. If he paid, it's his. He didn't pay, it's not. The Seifa uses a different word. Nishba, he swears. Why shouldn't the Seifa say nishba v'lo shilem? Why didn't the Seifa say nishba v'lo shilem? It says lizba v'lo rotza l'shalem. He doesn't want to pay. Tama de lo rotza. So the reason why it's not his because he doesn't want horotza. If he would have wanted afapi shelo shilem, then it should be his, even though he didn't pay because he wanted to pay.
Which would imply that your desire is good enough, right? You don't need.
So from the Sefer, it would seem that wanting to pay is enough to make a kinyan, and from the ratio, it would seem that you have to pay to make a kinyan.
Right.
So you have a stira in the Mishnah. That's what the Gemara is saying. It's a stira. So says the Gemara, El Mahal Lekha the Mishnah Mineh. So the Gemara right away gives up and says, no, you're right. We can't learn anything from this Mishnah. So in other words, there's a stira in the Mishnah, and therefore I give up. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to go weiter and is going to actually. So Tanya Kavas, let's just finish. Tanya Kavas and Rabbi Yochanan. No, we don't give up. We have a brisa beferish like Rabbi Yochanan. What's the brisa? The brisa says, "Asoicha para mechaveiro." If someone actually lends, in other words, he pays money, he rents a para mechaveiro benignivo, and we know that he's high for geneva. V'ama halo hareini mishalem ve'ena nishba. He says hareini mishalem. I hareini mishalem. I will pay. Not I pay. I will pay. Ve'ena nishba, and he doesn't swear. Va'achakach nimtza haganev mishalem teslume kefel l'socher. So this brisa seems to prove that committing to pay is enough. Remember, we have the question, stira in our Mishnah. Do you have to pay mamish? or do you have to commit to pay? And we right away gave up and said, you're right, we can't learn from the Mishnah. We can't learn from the Brisa. So the Gemara says, Tanya Kavasa Rabbi Yochanan, because in the case of Hasocher, where it was stolen, and he says, Hareini Mishalem, I will pay, I will. Trust me. The Eina Nishba, what does the Brisa say? Mishalem Tashlume Kefel L'Socher. You have to pay to the Socher. Why do you pay to the Socher? He didn't pay. Teretz is because he committed to pay. So from here we see that payment doesn't have to be mamish payment. It has to be commitment to pay. So that's the raya from this price. So we're going to stop here because the Gemara is going to pick up from here. But anyway, so we have a raya right now that even though our Mishnah seems to be a stalemate from that brisa in the case of Soicher, not Shemechino, case of Soicher, where he said Hareini Mishalem, then it's good enough. Now, this whole question will be the subject of further discussion, whether Hareini is good enough or whether you have to have payment itself. That's really the subject of the Gemara. But for now, we see from that brisa proof positive that if he said Hareini, that he gets kefil. The owner gets the animal back, or whatever it is, I mean, the value of the animal, and he is zoicha to kefil. Let's take a quick look at Rashi. We'll finish up. Rashi says, wait a minute, the Soich is chayiv in Geneva Avaveda, Mikol Makom, in Motzel, the Shaket. So this opens up a whole can of worms. Why should this Soicher have any standing? He is chayiv for Geneva Aveda. Says Rashi, Mikol Makom, in Motzel, the Shaket. If he wanted to lie, the Lishba, and to swear, Sha'onsa, that it was an accident. It was an accident happened. Nifta b'shvua. He can fulfill himself and be free with a shvua. Do you see how this works? It's almost like a migo. It's almost like a migo where he said, you know what? You're chayiv and Geneva. Why are we dealing with you? Teretz is, I could have said Nensa. And if I would have said Nensa, I would have been totally free. So believe me when I say Niknava, and therefore I'm going to pay for it. And I'm kind of kefil. So maknele kefil, niknelo ha kefil. So he gets the kefil. Okay, so we'll stop here. But anyway, you're starting to see from this Gemara that there are nuances here that which the Gemara will pick up on a little bit more next week. Mitzvah Shem is that it's not as simple as it looks. There are some times when what seems to be Shilem isn't Shilem, it's maybe Shilem, and also this whole concept of he could get away with it. In other words, the Gemara is even assuming. I mean, it's not right because he's an Erlich guy, right? Why would he say something improper? Because he could be Mishaker, and he could say Nemsa, and therefore I'm not chayiv. Therefore, you have to believe him when he says Nigdava, and I'm paying for it, and I'm going to get kefir. All right, so we'll stop here.
We also have something sort of not quite the same, but with the selling the chametz for Pesach, where the goy says he's going to pay, but he hasn't. Maybe he's given a token payment, but he certainly hasn't given the full payment before Pesach,
right.
And yet the sale is still considered valid.
Because it's valid, because we say it's not mamish. In other words, already paying a down payment or doing something to show a siman that you're paying, according to this Gemara, is sufficient to transfer ownership so that whatever happens later, you can't argue, oh, wait a minute, you didn't pay me for this. No, but I gave you a down payment. I gave you a deposit. That's my payment. And that, by the way, that is an interesting question. I mean, in our secular society, in civil law, is how we deal with that in big transactions when events happen where pledges are made, contracts are signed, the money's not yet wired, and this happens, and all of a sudden the whole thing explodes. And the guy said, wait a minute, you never bought it. So now we have to litigate. We have to say, wait a minute, he gave him a deposit. That's enough. So it has real world consequences. But here you see from the Gemara that at this point in the Gemara, it's not mamish. It's the pledge is sufficient to make it a transaction.
Rabbi, if you look at it one step behind, what would the Gemara, here we say that by him saying, it's okay, I'll take care of it, and then the cow is stolen, he gets the double amount that
Right.
he's awarded.
The kefil.
What happens? This is something that already transpired. How would the Gemara handle it beforehand? Would they concur with what they're agreeing with right now? Or would there be a big discussion and a dispute if it's valid or not valid?
No, but David, this particular case is telling us specifically that the whole thing transpires if it is stolen. In other words, up to the point where it was stolen, there is no exchange of ownership. The minute it is stolen, click, change of ownership. It happens at the time of the event. That's what this Gemara is talking about. Not that we made an agreement and all of it, everything. To your point, it didn't happen. The instant it happens is the instant that this whole transference happens, and that's the whole kasha.
Oh, I see.
You see, in other words, that's the shot here, is that it happened literally on a drop of a dime.
Same time. Yeah.
And now what do we do? Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you. Menashe.
Okay, so we